This is Super Investors and the Art of Worldly Wisdom. I'm Jesse Felder.
Object to the test!
This podcast is brought to you by the Felder Report. When I'm not interviewing one of the most interesting minds in the world of finance, I'm personally scraping the interwebs for valuable information about markets and investing. I put together some of the best things I find each week into a free Saturday morning email you can subscribe to at thefelderreport.com. Just click Join Now right there on the homepage and you'll be good to go. My guest for this episode is my good friend Peter Atwater. One of the things I most look forward to hitting my inbox is Peter's Financial Insights report sharing his thoughts on the markets and the world. His book, The Confidence Map, was also one of my favorite reads over the past few years. This is Peter's third time on the show, but given all that is going on, I think his framework has never been more valuable than it is today. So please enjoy my conversation with Peter Atwater. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jesse. It's great to be here.
You know, I have been intending to bring the podcast back now for some time, and I've thought when I eventually do, I have to have you back as my first guest, because I think the first thing I need to do is thank you for helping to keep me sane over the past few years. I mean, being able to communicate with you on a regular basis on your thoughts and ideas about what's going on in the world and markets has been invaluable to me. So thank you for that.
Well, the feeling is mutual, because the lens that you bring is so different from mine that every time I read something you've written, I go, oh, that I wouldn't have looked at it that way. So very helpful.
I appreciate that. You know, the main reason I wanted to talk to you, in this forum is because I really do believe that your book came out a couple of years ago now. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but I think it's even more relevant today than when it came out. The Confidence Map, I think, is just a wonderful framework for understanding not only what's happening in the world today, but also understanding how our own responses and feelings kind of manifest in regard to it. So maybe you could start out just kind of explaining to people who haven't read the book, the confidence quadrant and how that works.
Sure. So I've been teaching a class on confidence and decision making for more than a decade now. And early on, you start the class just trying to level set, which is, what is confidence? And after about the first week or so, I realized that as much as we use the word, we really don't know what it means. We know what it looks like. We know people who act like it, but what is it that makes someone confident? And that sent me down a deep rabbit hole. And I came out of it with two thoughts. One is that to be confident, we need to know that the world is predictable or certain, that we can have a sense of what's coming. But we also need a sense of control, that it's great if we know the road ahead is straight, but if we don't know how to drive the car, we're not going to be confident behind the wheel. From that, I began to realize that those two variables matter, both independently and together. And so what I developed was the confidence quadrant, which is a simple 2x2 box chart. Take certainty across the x-axis, take control on the y-axis, and look at them in terms of combinations, high and low of each. When we have both certainty and control, I call that the comfort zone. Why? Because it's easy, we're relaxed, our brain is relaxed. Things feel predictable. We feel like we know what we're doing. And so that's I think when we talk about being in the comfort zone, it's because we have both certainty and control in those moments, and time passes effortlessly. The opposite is what I call the stress center, because when we lack certainty and control, anxiety is the natural consequence. And one of the things I had to figure out in working on my book was, what's the opposite of confidence? And I ultimately settled on vulnerability. And what I like about vulnerability, even more than confidence, is its power to explain our behaviors. We are invulnerable when we feel confident, and we are intensely vulnerable. And that intense vulnerability explains panic and all of the impulsive and emotional behaviors we see, particularly in the markets. When people think about economic cycles or business cycles, market cycles, they think in terms of what I think of as a trolley car that goes back and forth between the stress center and the comfort zone. But the reality is there are two other boxes that to me are more important than ever in understanding behavior today. The first is the passenger seat, where we have certainty but no control. And we don't think about that until we're on an airplane and suddenly there's turbulence. But we spend a lot of time in the passenger seat in our lives, whether it's a function of working for somebody else or being on an elevator. I mean, there are lots of these situations. The weird thing about that box is it also defines a prison. In fact, a maximum security prison would be complete certainty and absolute powerlessness, the lower right-hand corner. Last box is the upper left box, which I call the launch pad. And that's where we have control but no certainty. When I talk to entrepreneurs, they tell me that's their their box of choice. Comfort zone's boring to them. But what investors don't appreciate is that's where every investment decision gets made. And they fail to appreciate the that anytime we're thinking about the future, we're imagining. And so stories really matter in terms of those choices we make in the launch pad.
Yeah, it's the visual framework is so helpful, and it's really, I think its simplicity is one of the genius things that makes it such a genius framework. Is you have I guess on the y-axis, low, a scale of the amount of control you have in a situation from low to high, and then on the x-axis the scale of certainty from low to high certainty. And so the lower left corner is low certainty, low control. That's the where you're talking about, being defeated, right? And the
Yeah.
top right hand corner is that invincibility area where you have high certainty or high control. And I think one of the most important things I took away from this book is I think we're all familiar with the idea of overconfidence, right? And pride goeth before the fall. But as you point out, underconfidence is just as valuable as of a concept.
Yeah, I mean, we are routinely underconfident. When there's turbulence on a plane, we overreact to it and fail to appreciate the near certainty we have of making it safely to our destination. And we see this over and over in the financial markets. And so we need to be careful at both ends, particularly because the stories we tell ourselves are so reinforcing. And so you need to be careful about those stories of underconfidence that you won't succeed, you won't succeed ever, and not realizing that real life moves us around. We are never in one box for very long.
Yeah, and I think when you think about this spectrum, from total defeat to the idea of feeling invincible, um, it really, I think, meshes well with another concept that you've talked about or written about a lot in the last few years, which is the idea of the K-shaped recovery, or really a K-shaped economy that we now live in. That is, I guess, defined by wealth and power inequality. And those living at the top of the K feel this sense of invincibility, and those living at the bottom of the K, feel an increasing sense of defeat. Do you think of it in those terms as well?
I do, and I think that there are stacks that go along with it. For those at the top, it's a stack of privilege that they have everything in terms of money, power, health, education, that the system that services them gives them a sense of effortlessness that is unavailable to those at the bottom. And if you think about those at the bottom, there is this enormous weight of stacked vulnerability that they feel vulnerable. It could be basic safety, health, education, voice. And so I think folks really don't appreciate that we have a class of have-it-alls at one end and have absolutely nothing at the other. And when folks think about the hollowing out of the middle class, they think of it in economic terms. I think about it in terms of the things that give people confidence. And so that's the hollowing out that deeply troubles me because I know that our preferences are so vastly different when we are confident and when we are feeling very vulnerable.
Yeah. And I think it's when you think of it in terms of those feelings, not just wealth inequality, but what is really behind that, and it's this idea of confidence. It really helps to understand what's driving it. I guess when I think about the upper end of the K, those with a lot of wealth and that feeling of invincibility or invulnerability, is maybe a good way to think about it. You can understand why I guess we've seen capitalism kind of evolve in a way towards what you framed as Caligulan capitalism. People feel more and more invulnerable and more free to kind of push the envelope in terms of law and these types of things. Maybe you could, what do you mean, I guess, by the term Caligulan capitalism, and what does that say about the confidence of those at the top?
So when I think of Caligulan capitalism, I think of it in terms of the the grotesqueness and the overt sense of I think of folks almost like the gingerbread man. You can't catch me. And what's so interesting to me about this moment is no one is even bothering to hide it anymore. The excesses are all but put under, stadium lights for folks to see. And we see it at this intersection where Wall Street and Washington overlap, and it's Caligulan in both the sense of power and money and influence, and folks are behaving in a way that is so apparently invulnerable that you wonder about it. In my case, I just wonder about its sustainability.
Yeah. Yeah. You just see, I think, um, I'm spacing on his name right now, but one of the top short sellers who's been really vocal about this being the golden age of fraud.
Yeah, Jim
The
Chanos
last
has
few,
been.
Jim Chan, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for the refresher. Yeah, and he's been just pointing it out, and it's almost astounding that in almost any other era, this would be seen as just egregious and out of line, out of step with the societal mood, and that it isn't today says something about that invulnerability of those at the top.
Yeah, there to me, there's a bubble in immorality, that there is no shame and there's no sense of right or wrong. That anything goes because you'll never catch me.
Right. Yeah. And at the flip side, in the bottom of the K, you see this sense of defeatism really manifest in one thing that I think we kind of were messaging back and forth about is this rise of gambling, and how 20 years ago or longer, gambling was seen as something to be embarrassed of, to kind of hide, and now it's just out there for everyone to see, and it really defines our sports, our markets, I mean all kinds of things. And so, how do you think? I think that reflects the sense of confidence or lack thereof of those at the bottom of the K.
So I see that as a reflection of the nihilism that naturally goes along with low confidence. One of the things I write about in my book is the five F's. And we tend to think of low confidence fostering those feelings of fight and flight. But you also see folks paralyzed by it. So you have freeze. The one that is fascinating to me is our follow response. And that is so evident in so many different ways that you see across social media, where following requires no skill, no effort, just get in line and hope you've picked the right person. And then the last one is fuck it. And I think we're seeing a lot of combinations. So I see a lot of follow and fuck it in the world of sports. I see it. And so what troubles me is, again, it's so obvious,
Yeah.
and 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 we see it in terms of what's happening in terms of pornography, and so our vices are all over the place. You really can't not look.
Yeah. I was just reading actually this morning an article in the Wall Street Journal that had some statistics about retail investors that show the median retail investor spends 6 minutes on research before buying a stock. And the majority of that research is studying a price chart that plots less than a single day's trading. I mean, it's astounding to me. Talk about gambling. It's literally
Yeah.
like, did the stock go up yesterday? I'm buying it today. That's the extent of the research that's being
and
done.
and they're buying 0 day to expiration options, so they're no different from the scratch off guys at the local 7-Eleven. I mean, it's a whole culture of lottery tickets.
Yeah, I pulled that quote from one of your recent reports that you compare the NYSE looks more and more like a lottery ticket counter at the local 7-Eleven. Everything's a scratch off. It's a great point, because when you look at the explosion of ETFs and things, that's what a lot of them are. I mean, the leveraged long ETFs, leveraged long single stock ETFs. It's how can we make this more of a gambling product, because that will be more popular with investors today.
And an addictive gambling product. I mean, we are the ETF. I obviously the ETF world probably doesn't think much of me. When I refer to a lot of it as Kinder eggs that have been stuffed with explosives, but this is an environment where the industry is feeding people the worst things that they could buy.
Mm-hmm.
But for the moment, it is certainly satisfying the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a great Charlie Munger quote about that where he says, Wall Street will sell shit as long as, shit's in demand. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what's going on. I want one of the quotes that I think when I read your book the first time really stood out to me, because I think this, a lot of people have talked about the idea that we're use the term a fourth turning. Ray Dalio has made the point that it's even bigger than 100-year cycle. It's the long-term, debt cycles coming to an end, and it feels like there's a lot of I guess fuel for potential change. I just pulled this quote from your book. While we rarely realize it in real time, invincible is the pride-filled moment before our fall, while defeated is the ash from which we inevitably rise. At both ends of the spectrum, just when we think the trend can't possibly end, it does. Ironically, the limitlessness we sense at the extremes is warning us of the spectrum's true finite length, and that an abrupt reversal is imminent. Do you think this helps to explain kind of the K-shaped economy that we live in? Do you believe that we're headed towards a reversal in the I guess the winner, will be the loser, and the loser will be the winner, to kind of, I guess, misquote Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
The times are a changing.
Yeah, I do. And I think that to listen to the media, it would suggest that the greatest divide in the United States is left to right, that it is the political polarization that is driving behavior. And I look at it and say, no, our biggest divide is top to bottom. As I said, we have a group that has all and a group that has nothing. And I don't think it is out of the realm of possibility that those at the bottom realize how badly they've been played by those at the top, and how self-serving it has been for those at the top. And there are far fewer of those at the top than there are at the bottom. And one of the things that we see over and over in history is that widely shared extreme vulnerability results in spontaneous social movements. And what unites people isn't the cause as much as it is the feelings. And so, what I pay a lot of attention to, as you know, is what's happening to the feelings at both ends. And I have to say, Jesse, in the years that I've been looking at this, I can't think of a time when those feelings have been more decoupled than they are today.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly feels like we with every and you actually wrote about this recently. Perhaps one of the things actually I'll come back to. Ruchir Sharma wrote a book recently called "What Went Wrong with Capitalism," and I think he highlights, some of the things, not necessarily the Caligula's capitalism aspect of it as you did, but one of the things he points out is the fact that the powers that be have come to the rescue of investors and the wealthy at every downturn, and that has been one of the major contributing factors to the growing inequality. And you wrote recently about this as well, that you believe that that may be a thing of the past.
Yeah, I question the lifeguard's ability to go out into the waves again. That when money is free, it costs the lifeguard nothing to bail out others. But I think that as rates have risen, you're starting to see at a federal level in the United States a clear unwillingness to help. And it represented to me in things like what we're seeing with FEMA and the unwillingness of the federal government to extend FEMA into communities. You've seen a similar tide change in Europe, where you have bail-ins as opposed to bailouts, where the expectation is that when there is loss, there will be the experience of loss. And so I think that sea change is moving. And I think that fundamentally, the one that nobody's really talking about is the potential for shareholder primacy to move to the back of the line. That the shareholder has been first in so much and in so many ways that I could see societally folks concluding that the shareholder needs to step back and way back.
Yeah, it seems to me that the bailout culture, that we've seen just kind of grow exponentially, right? I mean, it started out with Greenspan, lowering rates in response to the '87 crash. During the dot-com bust, it wasn't a very deep recession. They lowered rates to 1%, created the housing bubble, financial crisis. We got to go to zero and start printing money. And then the money printing went like out of control, and the reaction to COVID. And it seems like, it has to get exponentially bigger, or it has to just kind of go in reverse. And it does seem like we've reached a stage where they can't go bigger than they did in COVID because of the inflation problem that we created. And I think, the current administration seems like they've made it clear that they are not going to, at least ostensibly, prioritize Wall Street over Main Street any longer. And so whether the government can afford to do it or is even willing to do it politically is becoming a kind of a question mark.
Yeah, and I'm watching the federal government turn more and more over to the states, which to me is an interesting burden share already. I don't think it's gotten enough visibility that what we're witnessing with you know, all of the cutbacks at a federal level isn't so much that those services will fail to be provided, but that if states want to provide them, states are going to have to step up and cover that, whatever that was that the federal government once provided. So watching what's happening on the healthcare front, I think will be very interesting, because as the federal government exits, states are going to be forced to step up.
Yeah. And it does seem like one of the kind of theories that I've written about this year is that what's going on now with the Trump administration and the Doge cuts and the tariffs and a lot of these things is very similar to the Nixon shock, um, where we were running out of gold, and we had to close the gold window to essentially avoid a run on the bank, and it was trying to head off a financial crisis essentially back then. I think it's not too difficult to make the case today that a similar thing is going on with the federal deficit at 7% of GDP. Even what Warren Buffett this weekend made it clear that that creates a situation where debt feeds upon itself, and I think that's probably as close as somebody like Buffett will get to talking about the potential for a debt crisis. So it does feel like there are things going on where the administration is trying to kind of prevent that type of unraveling in the debt market. We've heard a lot about the treasury market and these types of things too. From that standpoint, I guess we could actually think about investors' confidence in owning long-term treasuries, right? There's been a sense of invulnerability in I can own treasuries because they are, risk-free assets. They are the standard for risk-free around the world. I guess how do you see that? And do you, in your work, do you see that kind of sense, that confidence shifting at all?
I do, and I think it is shifting dramatically, and I would extend it, Jesse, beyond treasuries. One of the things that I'm observing globally is that we are at a time where nation states are being driven by singular dominant political figures that have a different agenda than what global capitalism has taken as its norm. And here, I think it's important to emphasize, this isn't I'm not trying to describe President Trump in a veiled way, but I see him as one of many.
Mm-hmm.
I can look at Erdogan, I can look at Netanyahu, I can look at MBS in Saudi, I can look at Modi, I can look at Xi Jinping, I can look at Putin. We are living in a time where nation state figures are driving activity on a centralized basis more than ever. And for investors, the decision making, I think, comes down to two choices. Do I see myself as a potential beneficiary, or do I see myself as a potential victim? And that's not a decision framework that investors have had to use before. When it came to those terms, it might be, do I feel that way with, this specific company or maybe this sector of the market? But now we're talking about whole national economies and all of the financial instruments that are related to that. And those are mammoth moves that result. And I think that the challenge for the administrations in all of these locations is to be mindful of the large implements that are then used to cut things. Because you're not talking about paring things around the edges. You're talking about a fundamental risk in, risk out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to come back to markets, but I think you said something that's really important there about kind of this. It's not just Trump. There's a rise, and I think I've seen even statistics about that that show that there's a broader move in the developed world towards populist politicians, and I think that comes right back to those feelings of vulnerability and people's desire for increased certainty and control. How does that, I guess, that desire that people feel, that like burning desire for more certainty, control, fit in with this move towards populism?
So what you see in populist movements is that they originate in lows of confidence. You could look at the Tea Party, for example, which came to the existence the weekend that the markets bottomed in March of '09. And I single them out not politically, but as emblematic of the fact that low widely shared vulnerability spurs these sorts of spontaneous movements. What they require is a charismatic figure, someone who says, follow me. And we're not always good at that, making good choices. As I say often, in a cold rain, we will get in the car with anybody after 3 hours. That is better than where I am.
Yeah.
And I think behavioral scientists fail to appreciate the value of better. They think people need to make the best choice. It's like, no, when I'm feeling intensely vulnerable, I'll make any better choice.
Right.
And so better leads to these dominant figures because they're presenting a very, very positive outlook of what they can accomplish. I am the power. All you have to do is get in line behind me.
Yeah.
And together we will change the world. What individuals fail to appreciate is that while that may move them from the stress center to the passenger seat, the dominant leader never wants the followers to be empowered. That's the nature of the dominant, whether you call it authoritarian or organizations that are driven by dominant figures tend to put people in the passenger seat and seek to keep them there. And so I'm watching to see what happens to all of these populist movements as those who were expecting to be immediate beneficiaries begin to question, is this person who promised me everything actually delivering it? And we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, I guess through your confidence lens, I think about it in terms of, to people who are feeling intensely vulnerable, the idea of more of the same is terrible, right?
Yep.
Anything but this. And
We
so
vote out. We
yeah,
do not vote in. We vote out.
yeah, and so the candidate that looks most appealing to them is the person that looks so different from what they've experienced, and so it doesn't even matter how different, but just I'm going to change things. And I guess from their perspective, well, it can't get any worse, so
Right.
it can only get better.
Yeah.
But one of the consequences, I think, for investors to think about is when you make these moves towards, populist leadership, and these people that are in power, and they've garnered power and keep power through this idea of I'm going, I represent a radical change to the recent past, is that it shifts markets from becoming in an important way too. And I think you've written about the idea of mercurial markets recently. What does that mean, and how does that kind of affect investors today?
So if we think about corporate decision making, it tends to be very consensus oriented, very strategic. A CEO reports to a board, which is represents shareholders, and there's a leveling of amplitude that comes with that. That the swings are, yes, we have business swings, but there's relative smoothness to the ride. When you have a dominant figure who has been empowered to make all decisions across the board, now you have something that gyrates, and based on the whims of the individual, and how does that person wake up in the morning. And what we're seeing is that mercurial nature, which accompanies most of these dominant figures, results in dramatic swings intraday, overnight, based on their mood. And markets are no longer investing strategically. To your point earlier, they're betting on the hour because they know that things are likely to swing wildly. So why not position myself to take full advantage of whatever daily swings or hourly swings are going to come along with it? That this is a market to date, not to marry.
Yeah. I think it's ironic that one of the, I think, manifestations of invulnerability that I see in the markets um, is the popularity of passive investing. It's gotten to the point where I can just put all my money in the market and it will always work out okay.
Yeah.
And we've seen that grow to such a degree now that these shifts seem to. I guess I'll frame this as a question: how do you see this shift in markets and in geopolitics? I guess affecting this the confidence that's given people to go all in on passive investing.
I think it's going to challenge passive investing significantly. But I would also preface that with a thought that passive investing itself, that its popularity is a reflection of investor confidence.
Right.
Markets always go up, therefore it doesn't matter what I own. And and the challenge with that is that in an environment where we have dominant political leaders choosing who are beneficiaries and victims, that makes it very uncomfortable to own the market as a whole because you're going to lose every time something you own is made to be a victim, and you may or may not win with the beneficiaries. But you're going to incur all of those emotions in what you own. And and I think that over time, investors are going to grow impatient with owning where they're getting hit over and over and over. The other thing I would say about it is our passive investing is dominated by companies today that are globalist in nature. And they're not designed for the tug of wars that are going to take place between and among these dominant figures, where these dominant figures are going to demand that these companies carry a single passport.
Yeah, to the extent that multinational corporations were the greatest beneficiaries of globalization, right? They benefited greatly from being able to open their products to new markets overseas and also offshore production and lower their costs. It stands to reason that any risk to that framework is a risk to both top line and bottom line. And so it would seem to me that the writing's on the wall that what has benefited these companies and the markets, the US markets, for the past 30, 40 years is now under threat for the first time in over that span. You wrote in terms of about I guess specifically about this. I'll just read this quote and maybe you can give me some more thoughts behind it. As I survey the columns of other market observers, I see they tell their readers to ignore all the short-term volatility. It's noise, they say. I disagree. The ignore ship has sailed. The choice investors now face is to remain on board our mercurial markets or swim to shore. Can you just kind of, I guess, flesh that idea out a little bit more so people can have an idea of how you're thinking about investors, how people should approach their investments perhaps differently today than they've thought about them in the past?
I think investors have to accept that given the lineup that now exists, and I expect we're going to see more of this in Europe and in other markets where you have dominant national figures, your choice is a question of not who to invest in terms of companies or industries, but who will I invest in from a political leadership standpoint? Where will I invest from a political leadership perspective? And needing to realize that even once making that decision, nothing is static today. You need to be prepared for the dominant figures to have dramatic mood swings because they do. And the consequences become grave, interestingly, at both extremes in sentiment. One of the things that has surprised me as somebody who looks at confidence, I would have expected dominant figures to be generous and kind in all of the ways that the rest of us are. But what we see with invulnerability over and over is those are the moments they use to settle the score. And so being invulnerable often leads to consequences that you wouldn't have expected, where they lash out at something that just surprises you. So part of your job as an investor now is to understand who are the latent enemies that they're waiting to lash back at.
Yeah, and that's something that we haven't really had to consider. I think most people have kind of taken the opinion with their investments for decades now. Is politics doesn't matter. I don't need to think about who's in office, what their agenda is, because regardless, it's pro shareholders, it's pro capitalism, it's pro the wealthy, and so it's something I haven't even had to consider.
No, the analogy I'm using now is thinking about this in the context of being on a plane. When you were an investor in a corporation, you know who your cabin crew is. You can think about industry tailwinds or headwinds. You can think about economic headwinds and tailwinds. But the FAA regulation tends to be well down the list of things you're worried about. You know, Government is going to interfere in ways that are minor relative to the other things that you're worried about. Today, you've got government in the cockpit. You've got government, you know, dictating the economy. You've got government in influencing all of these different aspects of your flight, and you need to embrace that and appreciate that until further notice, you're a passenger on their plane.
Yeah, and one way that I've seen kind of I guess another way I can think of how your framework, this idea of confidence and vulnerability has manifest in markets in recent years, is the idea of diversification. I think the more diversified you've been, the more vulnerable, the more you felt left behind, and you think the markets haven't worked for you, and you've felt more and more vulnerable to missing out. Whereas those who the less diversified you've been, the better you've done and the more invulnerable you've felt. And that's one of these shifts that I really do feel like is potentially nearing a reversal, where we're going to see the value of diversification potentially make a comeback, and those who have gone all in on U.S. stocks or even just the Magnificent Seven or just Nvidia or just 3x Nvidia are going to
Mhm.
see that there's a that doesn't work over long periods of time, especially during times of upheaval.
No, and I completely agree that if I look at the pies that have done best, they may look diversified, but the sentiment in all of them has been piping hot.
Yeah.
And and my thought on diversification is, you need some things that are ice cold in your pie. That what creates the benefit of diversification is the mix of moods, not just the mix of ingredients. And particularly where you have national level mood being driven by single individuals, I can't think of a more important time to be diversified geographically, because things in nation states are correlating tighter and tighter and tighter.
Yeah, and across asset classes too. I mean, not just
Yeah.
people think I own the S&P 500. I'm diversified. Well, you own one asset class. Yeah, it's also, I think, really really helpful to think about your framework from that contrarian standpoint too, because a lot of the best investment opportunities are the ones that look the most despondent, the most vulnerable, right? And that, I mean, that are poised
Yeah.
to reverse.
Yeah. I mean, it should feel like you're lighting money on fire. I use the laughter test in social media.
Yeah,
As I think about what would garner the biggest response that I'm an idiot
yeah,
if I put that out on social media. Um, because that's I think of markets as social networks with money. And so that crowd power today is such a wonderful way to look at where sentiment really is. And as I said, if you think about what would be laughable, not just to walk into your boss's office, but go on social media. It's like going to the lunch table in middle school. It's like if you showed up dressed in that, you
yeah.
know,
Yeah, I had a golf coach one time who told me that in order to hit a really good shot, you have to be willing to hit a really bad shot. You have to be willing to really embarrass yourself. And I feel like that way in markets too. That sometimes I feel like. Am I really writing this? Am I going to be totally embarrassed about putting this out in the world? Those are sometimes the best opportunities are the ones you feel like an idiot
Hmm.
even considering.
Yeah, and appreciate that what a challenge that presents for political courage, for financial courage, for courage as a a virtue that we should be promoting. I think we underappreciate that one of the consequences of social media today is that it has made courage unaffordable for so many. And I worry about that because in systems to be effective, there have to be the courageous. And so what I'm witnessing is you have vulnerable individuals making very decisive decisions, and there is no opportunity for reshaping them, mitigating them. They're very binary. It's going to be all this or all that. That without the courageous, you lose the ability to temper decisions. And so I think we're seeing some of those consequences where folks are either silencing themselves or walking away or just stepping out and allowing so much to happen around us in a way that is unconstrained. And there, the invulnerable are going to make decisions that reflect their personal level of certainty and control.
It's such a wonderful point because those expressing a courageous contrarian point of view that's truly contrarian are either ignored or ostracized, in a lot of these platforms. And so it's really, not a valuable source of discussion, of important things in those types of areas. In terms of those contrarian signals, it's one of the things I think you and I message each other about most frequently. It's like, is look at this headline, look at this, and I think one of the things you wrote on this recently is the best contrarian indicators are the ones investors ignore or even better scorn. The idea that they could hold any value should be laughable. And, that's kind of what social media does is it either ignores or scorns the valuable signals, and the ones that go viral are really not that good of signals at all.
No, I mean I've watched this wave of magazine covers recently, in April, and the eagerness with which the crowd embraced them as clear contrarian indicators. And I look at the crowd's response and go, nope, nope. The ones that slip by are the best.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are plenty of them to see. It's just when the crowd picks up on something, that's the crowd telling you the crowd is in on the joke.
Right, right. And it's not contrarian at all. It's actually consensus. Yeah. And so it's not valuable from that standpoint. Yeah, you highlighted some indicators I guess a few months ago about a top in the dollar. We had magazine covers with a rocket ship dollar graphic just
Yeah.
and nobody really at the time suggested that those were contrarian. Turned out to be a wonderful signal. So um, is there anything that you're seeing in terms of contrarianism today that you think that's especially uh, valuable, maybe more on a longer term level where you're seeing some contrarian signals that are either ignored or some that are getting too much attention that you think are especially important to pay attention to?
I think if I hear the word uncertainty again, um, there have been so many references to uncertainty in the last 30 days. And normally I would say that that is a reason to be optimistic. Um, but what I think it overlooks is the powerlessness that many are now feeling. And so I'm watching that. Having said that, you and I have gone back and forth on gold, which, lots of unstoppable, the U word, which is,
Right.
our favorite thing to message back and forth. Uh, that's been interesting with gold. And so watching gold peak around all of this noise has been very reaffirming to me.
Yeah.
The question is a major bottom or the major bottom, and we'll watch and see how confidence develops.
Yeah.
But there's oversold, and then there's the low, and those will be likely to be two different things.
Yeah, yeah, it's unstoppable. It's one of those words that you've taught me to kind of look for. Another one on the flip side is uninvestable.
Right.
Right, we've seen whenever Wall Street says uninvestable,
Investable. Back up
you're
the truck.
yeah, exactly. Your spider sense you should be tingling and thinking, wow, there's potentially opportunity there. Um, Peter, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This is exactly what I hoped for. This discussion would be. I think it'll be very valuable to people to kind of be able to have a framework in for viewing a lot of what's going on in the world, a lot of the news they read. If people are interested in reading more of your work, where can they find you?
So they can find me at peteratwater.com. Um, and I'm on social media, both X and Blue Sky. They're becoming two very interesting echo chambers to bounce back and forth from one to the other, because you realize that we are just how different our digestion of news is these days. One of the most interesting conversations from my class this semester was around the consumption of media. And I asked, so what are events? What are things that we all watch from the same source? And the only thing they could think of in the past year was the Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that is a really telling statement on how unshared our life experiences are becoming. And not just because of politics, but because of how we gain information. And we know as communities, you have to have commonly shared experiences, and increasingly we don't.
Yeah, it's not just bifurcation and wealth and power. It's in different realities, right?
Yeah.
People have different realities now because they consume, we all consume different things. We're not all watching Walter Cronkite, or
No.
watching different and reading different things. I'll also say too that you publish regularly on LinkedIn, and I enjoy reading your stuff there. I recommend people check that out as well.
Yeah, I try and tailor my writing to the audience that I'm trying to serve. So if I'm writing about the financial markets, I do that through my financial insights work. If I'm writing about leadership or issues that I see in the corporate world, then I tend to write those in LinkedIn. And interestingly, I'm writing more and more um, sort of from a self-help angle, because one of the things that has surprised me about my book is how meaningful it's been to people in navigating the powerlessness and uncertainty they feel in their lives today. Not as leaders, not as investors, but as at a core individual level.
Yeah, and I think that is really important. It's one of the other reasons I wanted to talk with you, is because I do believe it's the book, the framework is really valuable in terms of thinking about markets, investments, companies, geopolitics, but especially it is from a self-help level. It's we all go through times feeling that overconfidence, and as I said before, that underconfidence concept I think is especially valuable for people who might be feeling those feelings of vulnerability, and understanding that that is the mirror image of overconfidence. And I think that's just a gift that you gave me, and I want to say thank you for that.
No, you're very welcome. I have been surprised. That was not the goal of the book, but it's been fascinating the number of times I'll sit down with someone and I think we're about to talk about their business or how they manage money, and they'll pull out I have a very clear memory of an individual money manager who started the conversation sharing the map that he had created about his journey with his wife through breast cancer,
Oh, wow.
and how helpful it was to be able to visualize those different moments and why they both felt the way they did in those moments. So
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a gift, and I thank you. So, Peter, thank you for taking the time to do this. This has been valuable to me selfishly, and I hope I know a lot of other people will find it very valuable in their own lives and investing activities. So, thank you.
it's been my pleasure. I think sometime, Jesse, we should do it where the Q&A goes the other direction, because I have a whole bunch of questions that I'd love to ask you. So,
Well, yeah, we'll do it. We'll do a reverse interview
right.
next time.
Yep.
Thank,
Thanks, Jesse.
Now, South on in April of 142!
For notes and links related to this episode, including where you can find Peter's latest work, visit thefelderreport.com/podcast. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the financial road less traveled.